It's
it?
actually Google Voice. And the reason I use it is it's actually a clear signal very often. And it allows me to
Hmm,
record my conversations when I want to and things like
that's
that.
smart.
But whatever. And Google Voice is actually illegal in Canada, but I have a workaround, so that's why it's a New Mexico line. Yes, you're not involved in a crime right now. Don't worry, it's not that illegal. It's just that there are a
Well,
lot
if
of
I was,
Canadians.
I'm not going to tell. So, I think as journalists, like, anyways, we obviously have to. I mean, we have to find ways to record our calls too. I have to like pay for a service
Oh,
when I
screw
use my
that.
cell phone, but I am actually at the office. So, yeah, you can thank my landlord who's doing a demolition downstairs for that. So,
Nice.
anyway, that's the work from home thing, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Um, well, I got your name actually from some of my colleagues had recommended you. Um, and I don't, did you want me to provide a little background just around the Northwest Territories, or are you kind of like familiar with the public
I'm
health
fairly up to date with
situation
what's
here?
going on, but if I express ignorance, I'm sure you can pop in and correct me on something. I know
Okay.
where it
Um,
is.
and, and my main yes, and my main questions are mainly around like what have the policy decisions been around vaccine mandates in other parts of the country? Here in the Northwest Territories, we basically our chief public health officer made an order saying, if you have a vaccine mandate in your business or your city facilities, you can have more than 25 people inside. But what that kind of resulted in is people with a little bit with like their pitchforks outside the city council meetings being like, don't pass the mandate. And then also some people being like, please pass the mandate. So
Right.
it was very contentious, and a lot of councillors had like essentially expressed that this was not like a decision that they felt they should have had to make. And so, yeah, I'm just trying to compare, like, what
Yeah.
happened in other jurisdictions and how do we kind of explain the policy decisions
Right.
that are
So
being made here.
I'm
So,
not
yeah.
fully up to speed on what's happening around the country. I'll tell you, in Ontario, there is largely a provincial approach. So, the province has dictated that bars, restaurants, and other kinds of venues must have proof of vaccination, and any such formal indoor setting has a capacity limit, which was lifted recently, but that lifting looks like it's about to be rolled back temporarily because of the increase in cases. So, to that extent, these are provincial mandates. However, the mandating of vaccine requirements in other businesses tends to be on a per business basis. So other than the ones stipulated by the government, restaurants, bars, gyms, and I forgot what else, um, other businesses are free to enact one or not. For example, universities have universally decided to make vaccination mandatory for attendance, but they don't have to. That's a decision that they all made independently, I believe. If you look around, like Singapore, I was just reading up on Singapore before you called, has a is it VORT requirement. So vaccinate or require testing. But that's also downloaded onto the businesses. So businesses are free to adopt that or not, but they are encouraged to adopt it. The big question is, if they do adopt it, who's responsible for enforcing it? It looks like the businesses are. And this has been the problem even in Ontario, where a restaurant is required to enforce a vaccination mandate for every customer coming in, but it's the poor minimum wage student at the front door who has to enforce it. So if the government is going to require this, they should really offer resources and personnel to help enforce this requirement. Otherwise, there isn't a whole lot of, to my knowledge anyway, a whole lot of monitoring of the extent of the enforcement of these rules. And there are some businesses that overtly state, we will not be enforcing this rule. And it's unclear whether bylaw officers are showing up and ticketing them at the very least or closing them down at the very worst. So that is unclear. Um, so the larger question here is, whose responsibility is it? Should government be mandating this process, or should individual businesses be responsible for making the decision? My feeling ethically is government has to, because somebody has to be the bad guy. The buck has to stop somewhere. Someone has to take responsibility for the not the bad decisions, but the unpopular decisions. And that someone is always going to have to be the elected official. If we allow business owners to be demonized for reasons outside their control, then you're essentially passing the buck on to them, and you are conferring upon them a responsibility for which they were not trained. Like a restaurant is trained to manage the finances and to serve food, and to a very large extent to comply with public health guidance when it comes to cleanliness of the environment, but not around enforcing the behaviors of individuals and, and such. The pushback against that argument would be that restaurants and bars are required to enforce things like age of majority. So your bartender has to check your ID before you're given a drink. The bouncer at the nightclub has to check your ID before you're allowed inside. So they're already equipped and expected to prohibit people from entering based upon not an arbitrary characteristic, but a demographic characteristic. So given that they're already required to do that, is it such a stretch to require them to do this as well? And the answer is, yeah, it is a bit of a stretch, because this is a different qualitative endeavor entirely, one that is deeply unpopular. If you're 16, try to get into a bar, well, you know you're not supposed to, and if you're tossed out, you're probably, you have to wait a couple of years until you're the age of majority. If you're unvaccinated and prohibited from getting inside a bar, you might perceive this as a profound insult to your civil liberties that you cannot work around without accepting a thing that you are morally flabbergasted and opposed to. So it is qualitatively different. That's a big info dump for you. I mean, the larger question of how does this differ around the country, it looks like for most of the country it's a provincial decision. And that seems to be what most of the country is doing. Globally, it's more complicated because the laws are different. It's unclear, which level of jurisdiction is responsible for which elements of enforcement. But we're in new territory here, and I'm sure new law will be written, a new precedent will be achieved at the end of all this.
Mm-hmm. So in Ontario, it sounds like you mentioned that you feel that it's the government's elected officials' responsibility rather. I'm just curious. So is it in fact the public health folks who did make that decision in a place like Ontario, for example, or was it the elected officials?
Well, it's the elected official made the final decision because this is a legal determination. It's a rule put forth by the province that citizens must follow. They're advised by public health. And public health is free, I believe, to alter some of the dimensions of that decision making at the local level, like add more restrictions, for example. But when it comes to an actual vaccine mandate, I'm not a lawyer, I can't say for sure, but that I believe is put forth by the province, because that's a rule around business operation. It's not a rule around public health necessarily.
Mm-hmm. And how is, you mentioned that many businesses are or are not enforcing the mandate. I'm just wondering how they feel, how you see things are going with the mandates in places like where Ontario, for example.
It's heterogeneous. Where I live in Ottawa, it seems to be fairly well accepted. In other places, I won't say exactly which places, but there are places where vaccine hesitancy is more common and the pushback is more intense. In gyms, for example, we see people taking off their masks because they're uncomfortable and nothing happens to them. In restaurants, people can take off their masks, but they're encouraged to put them back on when they go to the bathroom, for example, and that can be lax as well. You have people I went to a soccer game, for example, earlier in the week, and that required a vaccine passport check. And really the person sort of gave a cursory glance at my document and waved me through. They didn't investigate it deeply. I'm sure they didn't compare the name on the QR code to the name on my driver's license. I'm sure they didn't actually scan the QR code to actually see if it was fraudulent or not. So there's a spectrum of expectation of rigor here. At the extreme end, there is, of course, scanning your QR code, seeing the database entry, making sure the dates match up, making sure that none of this is fraudulent, and checking to make sure that the ID matches the name on the document that I present. And at the other extreme, it's like waving you through without even checking. So something in between those two poles is happening. The big question is how many people are attempting to skirt the rules, and is it a big problem? Honestly, I don't think it's that big of a problem yet. I think most people are on board with following the rules, or at least not attempting to overtly skirt them when it comes to vaccination. I think more people are sort of dancing around the rules when it comes to mask wearing, because that's a minute-by-minute ordeal for some people, and they can't keep it on perfectly all the time. But when it comes to, if you're not vaccinated, you kind of know that you're not supposed to go to certain places, and every time you attempt to do so, it's a bit of a stressful risk situation. So I don't think it's happening that often. Um, so if you look at Israel, for example, early on in the year, they had their Green Pass in place, and the Green Pass was one of the first models of a vaccine passport in the COVID era. And originally, they enforced it very, very rigidly. But then, as the case numbers dropped, they were enforcing it much more laxly. Sort of, they wave you through, they ask you, "Hey, do you have the Green Pass?" "Yes, you do." "You need to check it, just come on in." And then they just stop using it naturally when the cases really got really low. When the cases went up again, in the spring, the Green Pass was brought in, and I think it's still being used today. But that gave us a sense of how this could roll out. It's the expectation is that the rigor will fall by the wayside naturally and organically as the pandemic wanes, as vaccination increases. So this concern that this is a step towards authoritarianism and this is a permanent state of affairs, I think is an incorrect concern to have, because the Israeli evidence shows that there is a natural termination date of this kind of process.
Right. It's only as strict as those who are enforcing it. And this is not for my article necessarily, but I was recently in Ontario, and I did. Some businesses were like very serious, and then I did see what you've seen, which is that others were like, yes, we are not going to check anything. So, it's totally varying. I guess the focus for me here is, like, of course, this kind of interesting piece on compliance, which I would like to include based on your remarks. And then just the other piece, which is that, for people who are asking for saying that, like, this is a public health decision, and shouldn't public health make that decision? I'm just wondering if that's something that is a sentiment that is kind of shared in other jurisdictions before the vaccine mandates had come in.
I think most people understand that public health makes the strong recommendation, but ultimately it's the politician that makes the decision. So I'm unclear on the phraseology of your question. Public health doesn't make these decisions. Public health provides guidance.
Right.
And because public health cannot direct the police. Only the government can direct the police to do certain things. So we have to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is the purpose of having the vaccine passport, for example? And to my mind, there are three objectives here. And this has never been overtly stated by any government, as far as I know, and it really needs to be stated. The first objective is you keep the unvaccinated out of super spreading environments. The second objective is you keep businesses open because they will not be home to super spreading environments. And the third objective, which is a little more iffy, is if you reduce the exposure of vaccinated people to unvaccinated people, then you reduce the likelihood of breakthrough infections. That's less important. What's more important here is what you're trying to do is control community transmission by reducing the likelihood of super spreading events. And that is done by keeping those most likely to transmit, or the unvaccinated, out of the environments in which they are likely to become super spreaders.
Right. Well, the way that so I guess that does actually really help clarify things for me too, like the way that you're framing it as, of course, the public health officials, they can make that advice, but it really is up to governments to decide. So, I think that's some important clarity there.
The other thing that's kind of missing from to the way that's been communicated to the public is the expiration date of the mandate. And this is a dangerous thing to state. So in Ontario, the Premier has, in my mind, foolishly dangled this expiration date of sometime in January as being the point at which we stop using the vaccine passport. And I say foolish because then we have these hesitant people who don't want to be vaccinated deciding, I'll just wait then. I'll wait till the end of January and I can have my life back. And that defeats I meant to say that there's a fourth objective to the vaccine passport, and that is to increase and encourage vaccination uptake. And so if you have an expiration date that's overtly stated and tied to a calendar date, then suddenly that is obviated when people will just wait until that calendar date expires and they choose not to get vaccinated then. The public health component comes in by tying the expiration date to epidemiological metrics by saying we will remove the vaccine mandates and vaccine passports when we achieve these benchmarks in vaccination uptake, these benchmarks in community transmission, these benchmarks in health system usage.
Right. I guess the last thing that, and I will be able to use that to also explain to people the role of a vaccine mandate and kind of that. So, for example, Yellowknife City Council said these will expire when the public health orders expire. There's no date for the expiry on that one, so that is interesting. My last question is, do vaccine mandates seem to work?
Yeah, they do. And to answer that question fully, we have to ask ourselves, what are the objectives? And I stated three or four objectives already. I'll restate them. One is to increase the uptake of vaccination. Two is to remove unvaccinated people from super spreading environments. And three is to keep businesses open. So do they work? Well, everywhere that a vaccine mandate and a vaccine passport system have been introduced, within like a week, the number of bookings for new vaccinations increased dramatically. In some cases, doubled. So yeah, totally works in that sense. And we'll go back to who those people are in a second. Second of all, has it kept the super spreaders out of super spreading environments? Yeah, because in those places where the vaccine mandates and vaccine passports have been introduced, these super spreading events have been fewer. Not zero, but fewer. And not zero because people are still super spreading in their own homes or having house parties and things like that, which are informal environments that are not subject to the vaccine mandate rules. And have we kept businesses open? Yeah, we've kept businesses open as a result. Those places that have these rules in place, they tend not to have had lockdowns. Now, that's not perfectly true because Israel went through a bad scenario, so they experienced a little bit of restriction as well. Now, who are these people who the vaccine mandates and passports work on? If we ask ourselves, who are the vaccine hesitant? They are a diverse group. They include the anti-vaxxers. And they are the loudest group, but they are by no means the most common group. And we can pretty much just ignore them because they'll never get on board with vaccination until they're compelled to by law. Then there are the vaccine hesitant, and they are not anti-science. They're just scared. They've been fed a boatload of misinformation, and they just need some better information, some hand-holding, a conversation with a scientist or a doctor. Then there are the ones who want to be vaccinated, but they can't take time off work, or they have childcare demands and they can't risk the side effects. So they need different policy options like paid sick days or maybe a vaccine clinic close to where they live. But the biggest group that we can have a strong impact on with these policy choices are the apathetic. And they are not a small group. The apathetic tend to be younger, and they're not anti-vax. They just don't see a priority or a reason to take this particular vaccine because they feel strong and they have this indefensible belief in their own immune systems to be able to take them through this pandemic. So for that group, what they needed was an incentive to seek vaccination. Well, this is what gives them an incentive. Suddenly, your employer requires it. Suddenly, the local pub or restaurant requires it. Now you can roll your eyes. Oh, I guess I better get that vaccine now. As inconvenient as it is, I guess I'll go around and get it. I didn't get around to it until now because I'm apathetic. Not because I'm opposed to it, I'm just apathetic. And that is not a small group. So we know it's not a small group because that's the group that chose to be vaccinated when the announcements were made, and not before. We saw it in Ontario, in France, in Quebec, in I think, Alberta, and Manitoba, pretty much everywhere. As soon as the vaccine mandate was announced, the number of bookings just shot through the roof.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting to see those numbers, and I think it's quite telling as well. So, I'll just say epidemiologists certainly have their work cut out for them. So I really appreciate you providing your expertise and also the knowledge that you have just from watching things unfold. So thank you very much.
No problem. Good luck.
Anything else that you'd like to add that you want to make sure that I get?
Well, one thing that I think the public needs to hear is that this is not interminable. Neither the pandemic nor these restrictions. They will be lifted eventually. So the biggest concern is always, is this the new normal? Has the government taken over my rights and freedoms forever? No, this is an emergency situation. So I think if that is stressed more, people will be a little more content with these emergency rules.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that I meant to do at the beginning, but I think I was a bit excited about the topic. I'm just wondering, can I get you to just provide your name and title, how you wish to be referred to?
I am Raywat Deonandan, Raywatdeonandan, epidemiologist and associate professor, Faculty of Health Sciences, University of Ottawa.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to make a note that our conversation has been very interesting, and I am wondering if you'd be comfortable with me sharing a chunk of it with our current affairs.
Oh, please do. Please do. Yeah.
What they do is they might coordinate things like, reaching out to the mayor of a town or, our political leaders. And I think having this like science and expert background is really valuable for listeners. So
no problem.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Well, I will just send you an email if that's the case as well, so that you can also maybe just like have a listen out for that if you like to, in fact, listen to yourself how you're presented on the radio. I know it's very important to many folks. So, but yes, I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon. Maybe once we see how these mandates roll out.
Great.
So
okay.
yes.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you so much. Have a good day.